In 1964, archaeologists excavating a well shaft near ancient Sparta made a discovery that brought the dig to a complete halt. For decades, the accepted story was that Sparta threw its weak infants into a pit. Textbooks printed it, and documentaries repeated it. But bones pulled from this site told a different story. Mixed with the infant remains were fractured skulls and twisted spines of adults, men and women who had lived full lives. Finding grown citizens in the same disposal site as newborns forces an uncomfortable question. What society treats both its adults and infants as disposable material destined for the exact same hole in the ground? To answer that, we have to look past the Hollywood version of Sparta and examine the mechanics of their state, a system built for specific internal control. The blueprint for that machine begins with a demographic imbalance. This chart visualizes the population of the region, showing that for every single Spartan citizen, there were an estimated 7 subjugated reborers known as helots. The Spartans had conquered their neighbors in Messenia and absorbed them to harvest the grain and to press the olives. Without the helots, Sparta did not eat. The entire Spartan economy depended on an enslaved population that vastly outnumbered them, and in the 7th century BC, that population revolted. The conflict nearly broke the Spartan state. Ancient sources describe a desperate war where the military had to hold the line against the people working their own fields. Sparta survived the uprising, but the near collapse triggered a total societal redesign. Every institution, law, and ritual created from that moment forward was calculated around a single priority: ensuring that massive enslaved majority could never organize and rise up again. The first step in that control system was mass processing. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were forcibly removed from their families to enter the Agoge, a 13-year state-run conditioning program. They were stripped of their individuality, organized into groups literally called herds, and subjected to continuous deprivation. Food was deliberately kept insufficient. The boys were perpetually hungry and expected to supplement their meager rations by stealing. If a boy was caught, he was severely beaten. He was not punished for the theft, he was penalized for his failure to remain undetected. The historian Plutarch records the story of a boy who stole a fox cub and hid it under his cloak. When an adult approached, the boy stood perfectly still while the animal clawed and bit into his stomach. He died standing rather than reveal his theft. Whether the story is literal or a fable, it shows exactly what the system valued above all else: the absolute, silent suppression of visible suffering. That suppression had a specific use. As the most capable young men graduated from the Agoge, they were assigned to a state maintenance protocol known as the Krypteia. They were sent out at night, alone, with no armor and only a dagger. Their mission was to move through the countryside and assassinate any helot who appeared strong, organized, or capable of leadership. Under Greek custom, killing during peacetime carried a religious pollution. To bypass this legal hurdle, the Spartan government, run by elected officials called ephors, formally declared war on their own workforce every single year. Any helot killed during the Krypteia was eliminated within a legally sanctioned framework. The Agoge functioned as a manufacturing line, producing the ruthless enforcers required to maintain a domestic police state. A frequently cited piece of historical trivia is that Spartan women had more freedom than women elsewhere in Greece. They could own property, inherit land, and move through public spaces with a degree of autonomy that shocked neighboring cities. But framing this through a modern lens ignores the state's true motive. Spartan women were required to participate in mandatory public exercise regimens: running, wrestling, and throwing the javelin. This was not for their personal benefit. The state believed physically strong mothers produced physically strong soldiers, making the exercises a strict measure to optimize reproductive output. Marriage customs were intensely utilitarian. Spartan brides had their heads shaved and were dressed in men's clothing for the wedding night. Husbands under 30 lived in military mess halls and could only visit their wives in secret, in the dark. Romance was entirely eradicated in favor of strict state function. If a marriage failed to produce children, the state intervened. Policies allowed and sometimes dictated that an older husband introduce a younger, capable man to his wife, specifically to guarantee conception. The Spartan system completely erased the concept of the individual family. Human reproduction was treated strictly as a managed supply chain, built to ensure a constant, uninterrupted flow of bodies into the military phalanx. In 480 BC, that supply chain was tested when the massive Persian Empire invaded Greece. The defending coalition chose a narrow coastal corridor called Thermopylae to hold them off. The pass was so tight that the Persians' overwhelming numbers became irrelevant, forcing them into the kind of close-quarters combat where heavy Greek infantry excelled. The famous story centers on King Leonidas bringing exactly 300 Spartans to this bottleneck. But the small force was not chosen for poetic glory. Sparta was celebrating a major religious festival called the Krypteia, and Spartan law strictly prohibited military campaigns during this time. 300 was simply the maximum deployment Leonidas could legally bring without violating their own religious obligations. The specific criteria Leonidas used to select those men is telling. He didn't ask for the strongest fighters or the most eager volunteers. Every single man selected for the 300 was required to have a living son. The decision was driven by cold demographic math. Look at this schematic of the Spartan military pipeline. Because the Spartan population was so small, losing a citizen without an heir was a permanent blow to the system. Leonidas selected these specific men because their genetic contribution to the state was already secured. Their sons were already in the Agoge. Their deaths were calculated as acceptable losses that would not disrupt the supply chain. These citizen farmers and tradesmen from Thespians made a choice the professional Spartans didn't have to make. 700 of them volunteered to die on that hill, risking a massive portion of their city's future population to cover the retreat of the main army. History remembers the 300 Spartans and consistently forgets the 700 Thespians. The Thespians died in the same pass on the same day, but their sacrifice was a genuine choice. Human choices are much harder to mythologize than the perfect, unyielding output of a systemic machine. 40 years after the stand at Thermopylae, Sparta defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War and became the dominant power in Greece. But that dominance lasted less than a generation. The machine's design flaw finally caught up to it. Demanding total, lifelong military commitment from every single male citizen made it mathematically impossible to sustain a viable population. The numbers cascaded downward. By the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, Sparta's population had shrunk so severely that they could field fewer than 1,000 full citizens. They were crushed by a Theban general named Epaminondas. Then Epaminondas delivered the final blow. He marched his victorious army directly into Messenia and liberated the helots, instantly destroying the economic foundation the state sat on. Without the enslaved workforce to produce their food, there was no surplus. Without the surplus, the elite military class could not sustain itself. The Agoge, the Krypteia, and the entire Spartan machine permanently shut down. The legend of Thermopylae was the final output of a system that stripped away personal choice from the moment of birth. Leonidas and his 300 stood in that pass because 30 years of conditioning had made retreat a physical impossibility. Every Spartan hero was the product of a system that demanded total obedience, leaving its citizens with less personal agency than anywhere else in Greece.